So good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here as we go into this cold front in most of South Africa. I can certainly feel it on this side. And we're so happy that you joined us this morning for this very important topic. But it can also, there's so many aspects to this topic. When me and Krista were talking about our preparation yesterday and again this morning, our minds go in so many different directions because there's just so many things to talk about when you talk about something has to change about change. And as you know, we specialize in OD and change, and sometimes saying not necessarily the change management side of change, but the bigger picture OD side of change. How do you apply change? What do you do with complexity? All those kind of things. And we were surprised at the outcomes of some of the stuff that Willis Towers Watson shared with us on our webinar on the 6th of this month, which I'll share with you, which is why we decided to pick this topic for today. And it helps us to think about this, especially as we prepare and change and adapt our training courses and our developmental programs. We often do leadership and management development for team leaders, where one of our modules is how do you lead change as a team leader? And I have to say, in the past 2 years, our thoughts about that has been changing as well. So today, the idea is to give you a little bit of context and for us to have a conversation and to see where the conversation takes us and what we can figure out together in terms of getting better at it. So just to set the scene, I'm going to share some of the outcomes with you from the webinar. So for those who attended, we're not going to go into everything. It's just a few of those slides. For those who didn't attend, I hope you find this interesting. Let me just pull it up. There we go. Okay, so we hosted this webinar on the 6th of July, and our partners from Willis Towers Watson, who's helped us develop and who's certifying the new employee engagement and experience certification that we've launched and that is starting on the 17th of August. They presented some interesting findings and some of the work that they've been doing globally, but then with a specific focus on South Africa. So what they presented to us was South Africa, East Africa, and West Africa after they talked about global findings. And we're just going to zone in on the South Africa stuff today. So just to give you an overview of what it is they measure and what it is they look at. They've got this framework that they use. And as you can see, there's 3 levels of things that they measure and that they give feedback on. And then each of these then contributes to different aspects of the organization. At the top in the purple, you can see inspiration, drive, growth, and trust. These are aspects of mindset that is needed to succeed in companies. And as part of this framework, it's called the High Performance Employee Experience Framework. They say that the ones at the top, the purple ones, are the most important to differentiate high performance companies. And they find that the companies that is performing the highest scores high in these purple blocks. Then below that, we've got the blue ones, which is where you create personal agency. So do people have a voice? Do they feel that they can talk? Do they feel that they matter in the organization? And then at the bottom, we've got the foundational elements, the understanding, the organization, the fair play and support. And they say that if you lack in these areas, there's quite a high risk if you get these wrong. You'll also see that if you look at the vertical aspects, we look at people in this section, reward in this section, work in this section, and purpose in this section. And what they found in South Africa was this. Now, if you look at the scale on the right-hand side, high performance is green, and South Africa didn't score high performance in any of these aspects, which was quite shocking when they shared this with us. And if you look at the pink being the significantly below high performance level, we were quite pink. in some of these aspects. So where South Africa is not doing well is, if we take it from the top, growth. I'm achieving my potential. People feel they're not. I'm confident in leadership. They treat us with dignity and respect. There's a big issue with trust in South Africa. Then the voice, I have a say in what we do, very much an agency aspect there. And then fair pay and security. So my total compensation and benefit is fair. They scored the lowest. Then if we look at the gap to high performance level, they felt that there's not much support from my supervisor and our team is not getting built. Collaboration, we help each other and work across boundaries was quite low. I'm developing my capabilities was low. Inclusion, so diversity, equal opportunities quite low, and drive was also low. We're agile, totally focused on our customers ahead of the market and products and service. Didn't score very high there at all. Then where we were almost making the mark, approaching high performance, inspiration was quite high in South Africa. I'm inspired by our vision and we're a responsible company. I get what we do and how I fit in. The understanding was higher. Organization was higher. We're efficient, flexible, and continually improving. And yeah, that's how South Africa scored. So it was quite concerning for us to see that we had no green levels. And then we unpacked it a little bit further to just look at what South Africa did really well in and what South Africa didn't. So these are the favorable ratings, the ones where we had the best scoring questions in comparison to the high performing benchmark globally. There's a strong belief in products and services. 95% of companies rated that favorably. We understand our goals, which I found very interesting, and I'm quite happy about this. Just thinking that we were 4% higher than the global benchmark in terms of understanding our goals, understanding our objectives, understanding the link between our work and the business objectives, which we often find is a problem. There's a strategy, but I don't understand how I fit in. Seemed to score quite high in South Africa. And then the other one was 80% of organizations rated it favorably, that the quality of the products and services is something that they believe in and that they thought they were better than their competitors. And then just the last slide that I'm going to share with you, and this is where we got our inspiration for today's talk, is this is where South Africa scored the lowest compared to the global benchmark. Only 42% of South African organizations responded favorably to making decisions promptly. Managing change, only 46% responded favorably, and the benefits offered. Now, if we look at the managing change one, here at the bottom, we were 30% lower than the global benchmark in terms of feeling that top management manages change well. Now, this isn't we handle change management well. This is top management handling change well. So we're thinking there's something coming in there about change leadership, which is one of the topics we want to explore today. What is change management? What is change leadership? Because we're definitely not trying to convert our senior leaders into change managers. But there's something missing. And then we scored 23% lower than the rest of the world for communicating down the line, which is also one of the measures of how we manage change in South Africa. Okay, so looking at that and thinking about that, we wanted to talk about that low score and to say what needs to change about change. Why are we getting it so wrong in South Africa, and why, how, what's missing, what's actually being handled well. So we're going to kick off with a breakaway. There's not many of us, so I'm just going to divide us into two rooms to talk about and have a conversation about, in your experience, and make it specific to your experience. How is change handled in South Africa? What's working, what's not working, what's missing? There might be areas where you feel we're strong or certain organizations are strong. or that you've experienced big wins, and there might be that you didn't. And think a little bit about what sits underneath that. I'm just going to set up the breakaway rooms quickly. Okay, you should get your invitation now, and we're going to take about 10 to 15 minutes for this conversation, and then we'll share what we've talked about and see where that topic takes us. You should get the invitation now. Okay, so what did you guys talk about? Who was in the first room? First room had Amisha, Danielle, Estelle, Riva, Christy, Richard. What did you guys talk about?
I had very interesting things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that what I heard is it's like a few things, and guys, you must jump in here. I'm just going to give my very biased view. Is one thing is that change tends to be like this rigid top-down thing that hits the organization, and the moment it hits the rest of the organization, that can even be senior managers. So it may be this thing that comes from group level, from the board, and it hits the organization. And from the moment it hits the organization, just basically nobody really knows what's going on, and they have to get everyone along. So that's a major problem. Now we try to fix it with things like communication, but nobody knows what to communicate. And we try to manage the mood of the organization because everyone is actually scared, but we're trying to manage as if nobody is scared and they must just buy in. And there's that whole kind of thing. And then a point that came out very strongly is, I think, is that at the levels that are managing change or leading change, I would say managing change, there's a lot of naivety about people's experience of change and their desire for change and their willingness to actually enter into this thing. We make a lot of assumptions. We make assumptions, Estelle said this, we make assumptions like people want to innovate and make things better. Actually, like, whoa, no. You know, I'm going to lose my job if I make things too good. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's in there. That's sort of what I heard. It's like very difficult.
Anybody else from that group?
I think you've encapsulated it well. I would maybe just add that we are very poor at planning a change. We're quick to make a decision and say we're going ahead, and then we try and figure it out as we go. And I think there's an argument to be made to planning first how you're going to roll something out, as opposed to just dropping a bomb and then everybody's sort of feeling out in the dark.
Yeah, but and then sometimes, like Krista said, it just hits the organization. It's like a top-down thing, and it hits. So when are you supposed to plan? It's like, you know, that metaphor of trying to build an airplane while you're flying it, while you're refueling it with no landing strip in sight, because it's already happening. And the expectation is that it must be happening, and everybody's still in shock. No. Any other thoughts from that room? Okay. What about the other room? Who did we have there? Kathy, Calvin, Marie, Nikki, Tijan, and Edith.
Okay, so the group has asked me to give the feedback around what are some of the thematics that we see around change and why it doesn't always land or sometimes just fails completely. So generally the sense was that, you know, very often where change comes from is, you know, external or higher up being senior management or the board, to Chris's point. But in executing and landing that change, it's then outsourced to, you know, an HR and OD person. And I think that they will pedal as fast as possible to try to take up the change and just kind of bring it or force it into the system. But the challenge with that approach is that there's often low levels of trust from people who must receive and embrace that change. Particularly because if things are going to change, people want to engage with leaders. They want to hear, what do the leaders think about this particular change? How are they absorbing some of that change? And then often leaders just stand back because their hope is that actually somebody that's better qualified in the form of a change manager of OD who can run with this. And then that obviously perpetuates the cycle of actually the change not landing. And then somebody referenced the beautiful work of Francis Frey, who speaks about a deep devotion when it comes to change. And that's actually sometimes where the gap is that leaders must be invested in this change. They must have a deep devotion to seeing it through. And often that doesn't happen with leaders. And that's to the point that I made earlier on, them standing back and hoping that somebody else will run with the change. And then we spoke around just the level of change fatigue. Like, I think organizations underestimate the amount of change that often gets thrown onto people, purely because organizations are set up in almost a silo form where actually the different functions all have strategic priorities, which they're all trying to get through, which they're all trying to push into the system. And then ultimately people just become resistant and they're tired. They're just tired of all the ongoing change that's not always managed properly. And team, please jump in if there's anything that I've missed. And then there was the sense of the fact that, you know, people also know that this change is going to change as well. Like the constant agility also makes people fatigued, because they know, depending if there's a new leader or a new function or a new trend in the market, there's going to be change. And as a result, they're not as vested in the success of that change. Yeah, and overall to say that, you know, change only happens when there's high levels of trust. And generally it's hard to maintain the trust in organizations. And if there's no trust, it's very difficult to land change. Team, is there anything that I may have missed? Oh wait, one last thing is also the how-to. I don't think, you know, even when leaders are vested, it's not even that they want to stand back. I think the how-to is also underestimated, to say, you know, how do we have meaningful conversations? How are we in dialogue? And how do we listen, but listen deeply to how people are feeling? And so the gap sometimes is leaders' ability to be able to sit with change and engage with it in a way that's meaningful and impactful. That's often underestimated. So when leaders are asked to lead change, you know, some of the examples we got is that they think, well, they've conceptualized it, and then the how-to is just an email, you know, to the whole organizations, and a pray and spray approach that, you know, people will receive it and engage with it and run with it. And so the how-to is definitely a gap in terms of making sure that leaders are capacitated to take up change. Guys, do you want to jump in if there's anything that I've missed?
No, I think you did a good job. Well done, Bree.
Yeah, represented us well.
Yeah, you did. I think the one thing that also came out was that because of this, we get the opposite effect of what we want, which is people actually disengage for all of the above reasons.
Yeah, so all these things that happened, like you say, Kathy, all of the above reasons, then causes people to disengage. So the net effect is then that change is being handled even, I don't know, not worse, but it's just not happening. You get more resistance, more disengagement, and we just don't move forward. So what I've heard here quite a bit is that leaders don't know how to. Leaders stand back because of a lack of confidence. Leaders feel they're not sure what to do next. They feel that they don't even know how to listen. I think sometimes they don't know that they should listen. How to be in dialogue. Don't have confidence. Hand over, outsource. Bad at planning. Silos, change fatigue, constant change fatigue, knowing the next change is coming. Yeah, and we always say when we talk about organization development, we have a framework called the Congruence Model, where we say in order to have something like a high performance culture, you need a proper strategy, well communicated, that makes sense, that works for the context, the complexity of the organization, whatever that is. And I think at the moment that also means it shouldn't be too long term. You then need the organization to be capacitated and set up, designed to execute on that change. But then you need the leadership. And if you don't have the leadership that believes in the change and that walks the talk, then this triangle of these three elements falls flat, and in the middle is supposed to be this culture that we are creating, and if it's not there, if one of those three elements are not there, it won't happen. And quite often at the moment what we're finding is it's the leadership one that is falling flat. And I remember earlier on in last year, more towards the beginning of the lockdown, in quite a few of the conversations we had, people would say, geez, there's so much resting on these leaders, and they're also scared, and they're also confused, and they're also fatigued, and they're just human. But even saying all of that, it's not an excuse. People need leaders to look up to. They need the leaders to lead them. That's like the word leader. They need to lead people into the change, and they need to do it well. And as Marie said, we need they need to be capacitated. So for our next conversation, and I'm going to make the rooms a little bit smaller this time, and then to come back to say, well, how do we capacitate leaders? If one of the things that we've noticed in our conversations today is the change also comes at these leaders. It's not necessarily them that made the decision. It might come from a higher place. And they are just expected to roll with it. And what they then do is hand over to people with change management in their title, whilst the employees are looking up to them for guidance, and they don't have the confidence to do it. How can we help? How can we support? How can we capacitate? How can we enable and give these leaders the tools that they need? What are those tools? How do we do it? This morning in our conversation, Christy said, you know, it all boils down to we have to help them to be human again, almost.
Yeah, I do think that's a bit arrogant from me to say I'm going to help other people to be human. But what I want to say, what comes up for me strongly around this thing of the leader, and just linking it back to the Willis Towers Watson research, at the top line, the thing that was very low in South Africa is drive and trust, of course. And trust is a very big thing, but drive was quite low. And Willis Towers Watson has got a very specific definition of drive. It is around things like agility and adapting and changing and so on. So that's low. Then in those scores where South Africa scored lowest, was managing change was very low. But as low almost was the question of decisions and people at the top not making decisions. And what strikes me is this very deep, profound thing that we have in organizations of, I don't know, waiting for saviors. and thinking that the leaders are going to be the saviors and they must save us and they must make decisions. And we get very angry. I see it now with Cyril Ramaphosa. Everyone is like angry because the president is not making decisions. You know, he's not firing cabinet ministers, etc., etc. Everyone, and I think we like deeply and fundamentally not in touch with how complex things actually are for leaders and how little leaders actually know and can do in certain circumstances. So that whole question of agency is that you mentioned, Liesel, is you know, this who does the change, who takes responsibility for the change, is an incredibly huge challenge as we take it in. It's not just a matter of we going to have people who tell us what to do, and what they must do is convince us. Because from the conversation, it seems to me that leaders don't have agency to a large extent. That's why they don't make decisions. And they also don't know what's going on.
Yeah, and if we look at how we scored in terms of the elements that does measure agency, which is this area here in the middle, significantly below, I have a voice.
Yeah.
And gap.
Yeah. People feel they don't have a voice. And they feel they don't have a voice, and they want leaders to tell them what to do. So there's like a funny thing going on there, which is an interesting thing to take into the conversation. Okay, so what do we do about this? Is this thing of like, people don't want to take responsibility, but they do want a voice. I mean, if you look at that bottom line thing about the rewards and so on, there's also quite a bit of entitlement in the South African score. But there's this frustration with leadership for not making decisions, for not telling. You know, what I heard so strongly in the conversations from both Daniel and Riva is that we have senior leaders who are in a position where they really don't know or really don't agree. Senior leaders have not had a chance to voice their view on things, and now they have to create certainty and lessen the uncertainty for people at the lower levels.
Yeah.
I think there's this, if I can maybe just add, I think there's this idea that the people won't understand why we've made this decision, right? It's very strategic. We're putting things together. They must just trust us. And I think it's got to do with this entitlement thing and the way that we are still in this country is a very old school form of leadership where if I'm the boss, I make the decisions and you just listen. And I think that's where we miss the connection between saying like, how do we take people along? Because like, I don't have time to explain the whole thing. just trust me, it's the right decision. I think that's where it often falls apart a lot because the people at the bottom are saying, you don't understand what I'm doing. So your change doesn't make sense. There's a missing link for me.
What you mentioned is really interesting for me because there's this just trust me. From the higher up you go, it's just trust me, I can see it all, I know what's going on, but I don't trust you to understand it. So there's not a reciprocity in the trust. So the problem with trust is not that we don't trust the leaders necessarily in the organization, it is the leaders don't trust us. There's like a funny thing going on there.
But I speak into what both of you have just spoken about. I wrote down here a large part of change leadership is done between changes, and if people have bought into their leaders, they will also buy into the change, and trust is essential there. And what you just said, Christo, brought a new element to it, is that trust has to be both ways. And that's why I said it's work that's done between the changes. Because if you have a very healthy relationship with your people, when change comes, they are way more likely to trust you and go, this guy knows what he's doing, or this person knows what they're doing, and I trust that they're doing it for the right reasons. And then you don't need to have the full explanation. But that trust is a two-way street, and it's built up over time, and it's not built up in time of change. It's actually built up between the changes.
Yeah, that's so important, because when the change hits, it's actually too late.
Chris, I just want to add, and Janella actually captured it beautifully around, there's also something that you said about people feeling entitled and just waiting for leadership to give them the information. I think it's that, and it's also the balance of, does the system actually encourage and authorize people to have agency? Because I think people will only challenge to as far as their memory allows them to. And by that, I mean, it's, last time you challenged the change, were you punished for it? Were you considered to actually be going against the grain? Because if the system doesn't allow for people to challenge and engage in a particular way, then generally people are going to be mute. They'll be mute to change, and they'll wait for leadership to be able to give them guidance. And so I think part of the challenge also is organizations actually encouraging people and actually enabling them and say, actually, you are part of this change. And so you are authorized and actually mandated to influence it, as opposed to just receive it.
I think that is absolutely so. And I think that because that's not happening, that's why life is so hard for change managers. Because change managers have to do this job that is actually, except for a few technical aspects, they're expected to do this thing that is actually impossible for them to do. They shouldn't be tasked with it. They can't create buy-in. Change managers can't create buy-in. We always used to say in the change management course that buy-in is a swear word, which is an interesting thing as well. It's like, if you are buying, you're trying to sell people something that they probably don't really want. So what are you doing?
Krista, you touch on such an important issue, and the language that we use to talk about these things is also a manifestation of the ill health of the practice. And I was just thinking, when you were talking, Liesel, earlier, how you talked about the culture being at this thing at the center. Thinking one of the big changes that is probably needed, that would bring about a beneficial effect, is for leaders to understand that culture is not a thing out there, they are the culture. The culture begins with them, and it is shaped and influenced. Its tone, its odor, its level of oxygen, everything is determined by the leaders, and that's actually the real role of leaders. I mean, I have a friend, ironically, his surname is also Willis, who's doing work in the environmental space, and he's been interviewing the senior people globally, scientists who are dealing with climate change. And he's saying he's hearing that actually we've lost it already. The whole narrative around, if we just do everything, we can keep the average temperature within a 1.5. That's actually, we've already lost that battle. And his question is, what kind of leadership is being called for in impossible times? Because we talk about change as something, we have a project, we're going to, do a different IT system, we're going to move from one building to another, we're going to do this. Actually, the change that is coming because of the environment, and it's not just a natural environment. We are not separate from that natural environment. I think that's the thing, that it's the underlying narrative of separation, of things being out there. The people are out there, they must receive and enact and buy into the change. The language of agility, where does that come from? We talk about sprint. I'm listening to your language. That comes from athletics. It's about competition, winner takes all. You know, let's trash, let's beat the other guy. That language is not going to help us to deal with the kind of change that is going to be coming across. And it's totally, I was in your talk about the Barney, you know. If that's a reality, what has to change is not just the model of change, it's the whole thing. And it's very complex. But it starts with the leaders. So how do we prepare leaders? And I think we've got to start, people have to start becoming aware of the metaphor, the language. What is that saying? What's the fundamental model? Because that's what shapes everything.
It's interesting, Kathy, as you speak. For me, what's interesting is how pervasive this thing is of them and us, the leaders and the people, the shareholders, and it's always these like splits, and it's always the other people who must do something. And I hear you about actually change in impossibility. That is really what we are facing. In most organizations also, they're going through these planned changes, but at the same time, they're going through all of these unplanned changes that are just happening. Like nobody plans COVID.
That makes me wonder, I don't really want to take this conversation to a completely different level, but Chrissy, you were talking about what we teach in some of our courses. So in all of what WorldsView does, one of the underlying frameworks that guides our thinking is complexity. And we know in a simple environment, cause and effect is known to everybody. In a complicated environment, it's not known to everybody, and therefore you call in the experts. And I sometimes think we revert to, let's call in the experts, and they are called change managers. In a complex environment, change and effect is not known because what worked yesterday is not working today, which is more where we are now. And what needs to be done there is to look for patterns to emerge, consultative leadership. And then if we go into chaos, where there is no patterns, nothing is working, nothing makes sense for anybody, leadership is the first person who acts, the first person who does something. So leadership is acting. And if I'm thinking, Kathy, I wrote this down in a different color pen from the rest of my notes. What kind of leadership is being called for in impossible times? And I'm wondering if, without trying to label stuff, if impossible times, is it chaotic times? And can complexity theory help us think about what kind of leadership is needed? No. So we've got half an hour left, and I want to make the conversations a little bit smaller and then bring it back to the bigger room. Yeah, Estelle, sorry that you need to leave. So I'm gonna create some breakaway rooms just for like 10 minutes, and then for the last 15 or so minutes we come back to the main room and see where we get. This, okay, so the very easy, simple question for you to discuss is, how do we prepare leaders in impossible times? And let's see what we can come up with. Maybe we at least inspire each other. Okay, just get the image. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left, so let's hear what the conversations brought up. Shall we hear from room 1 first? That was Kathy, Riva, and Richard. What did you guys talk about?
Well, we were talking about this thing about leadership in impossible times, and the disjunct between leaders and the people who actually are in the customer facing roles, and how the education that we have has, and also the system has generated the sense of hierarchy and the divisions between people. So we're talking about what are we going to do as leaders to generate the willingness and ability to go out, and even that I'm mindful that's a language that's expressive of the system, and meet the people on the front line, which is another military metaphor, and be able to have conversations as human beings, one-to-one, rather than in terms of the roles and the suits and things. I don't know, Richard and Reva, if you want to add something to that. That seems to be a core challenge that we have. And I think where we got to also was that the system is highly complex. It's pervasive. It's entrenched. It's old, and it's also probably now reached it's beyond its use by date. But we can't wish it away. It's not going to change overnight. So how do we work at changing it? And also, we don't have a lot of time. But I'm adding that now.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing is how do we generate the willingness and ability to go out to the front line? And that's almost not a skill. It's almost an awareness. Willingness and ability. But they need to want to go. They need to understand how important it is to do that. And I'm saying they, and I hate saying that. But, no. Reva, Richard, anything you guys want to add?
No, I fully agree with Kathy's wonderful summation. And I think I said it in our group, is I had this realization that I have a lot of biases that I've built up over time in organizations, in my general life. And those biases come from the system. So, you know, I said to Kathy, if management comes to me and says, we're doing this, I'm already in a us and them situation there from past experience. I'm already, that's my starting point. And that's just not healthy. And the way I see it is that starting point came from within the system over learnt experience. And that tells me I must start from this point. And for us to move beyond that into that space Kathy was mentioning so nicely, we need to start acting from outside the system. We need to think beyond our own experience so that we can say, if we need a system change, we can't work within the system or use the system tools to change the system. You've got to actually move out of it. So I'm going to work on not being us and them in that situation, because that doesn't get anyone anywhere. And you know, for me, that's a starting point. I think it can expand in a much bigger way, but yeah, that's what I've taken from it.
Oh, thanks, Richard. Edith, Marie, Nikki, and Tijan, you were in the room together. Anything that came up there that hasn't been mentioned?
Tijan, I'm mindful of the fact that I know you said I must do the summary, but we ran out of time, and so you didn't get a chance to give your contribution.
No, that's fine. I can happily summarize. I took some notes, and I was going to say exactly what Nikki was going to say at the end. So really, we're saying that if leaders can spend more time just understanding themselves, understanding their gaps. Because I think a lot of leaders want to do this well, but they just don't know how to do it well, which is why they defer it to HR and OD. So they can become a little bit more authentic and a little bit more vulnerable around what they need to know, be able to then understand what the change is, why it's needed, communicate it well, involve people, and just getting those basics right. I think it'll go a long way. We were saying that they're very overwhelmed generally around how much there is to do. So they get caught up in just delivery mode, metrics, hardcore deliverables, and find that they don't have time to do all these other things. And these people stuff and the change stuff becomes fluffy and they're just tired with it. But we thought of maybe putting them into thinking groups, creating safe spaces where they can learn the skills of facilitation and coaching and asking questions, just being able to really understand the basics of change. And it's not this big scary thing. You don't have to follow these fancy change models. And that's the other misconception, that you have to have this whole framework in order to do change well. And actually, it's just about listening to people and asking questions and engaging and taking them along and letting them vent. That's change. You can do all the other sexy stuff, but you just get the basics right, it will work. Yeah, and then we ran out of time and I was going to echo what Nikki had said about that.
I love that you say facilitation skills. Yeah, it's hard to not be. We always say, be the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. And there's something in that, I guess, even if you talk about coaching skills, the basics of how do you have conversations with the people that matter? How do you take them along? How do you involve them? How do you listen? Get the basics right. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Tijan. Marie, did you want to add anything?
No, thank you so much, Tijan. Really well summarized. I think the anchor point was really around awareness, for leaders to be really have a great level of self-awareness around their own biases, their own resistance to change, because if they're aware of it for themselves, then they can recognize it in others and engage in a way that's authentic. So yeah, that was just overall the feedback.
Thank you. And then the last room was Danielle, Calvin, and Christu.
And I should speak to the group. So I think what we said is that obviously in impossible times or difficult times, there's a lot of uncertainty and fear in the system. And very often people are looking for honesty and they're looking for just answers to their questions. And leaders themselves very often have a lot of questions themselves and uncertainties. And so what frequently is required in that kind of scenario is for leaders to, what we actually need is authentic leadership, for leaders to lead honestly, openly, with vulnerability, because when you allow yourself to be vulnerable, you also provide an opportunity for people to build trust with you. And so this is one way of connecting with people and creating that psychological safety that people need in order to move forward in that kind of environment. Christo and Danielle, you can add.
No, nothing from my side. I think you've encapsulated it well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I almost, Christo, I want to put you on the spot. I like doing that. Because I think you can handle it. We've got like 6-7 minutes left. So can I ask you to also say what you heard in this discussion, and maybe just then summarize kind of the what these three groups came up with to take us to the end of the session.
I think what's really interesting for me is that the conversation that go to the point of the development of the leadership, the leader's person, the leader's self. There's things around maturity, authenticity, the ability to be where you are, to go where you are, to you know, to actually reconnect. You know, before the breakout, I mentioned the thing, or we mentioned the thing around inviting leaders to be human. And I think as you go up in the organization, you are expected to not be who you are to a larger and larger extent. You are expected to not be fearful. You are expected to not be uncertain. You are expected to not be soft, whatever. And leading in times of impossibility, the first thing is we all in this impossibility, and we're all just human, no matter if you are the chair of the board or whatever. Except if you're Bezos, then you can go to space. But whatever reason. But for us human beings, we have to be human beings. Yeah. And there's this requirement for us to be able to stand inside that uncertainty. And more important than change almost is things like solidarity and connecting with each other and facing what we are really facing and making sense of it together. I asked the question of Calvin and Danielle at the end about teams. I'm wondering sometimes if we are over-focusing on this change thing, getting completely worked up into the change thing. And it becomes this sort of abstract thing. I heard what Jen said about we actually don't need all of these models. They're like not useful. They're like, I don't know, you know, change management stuff. Whereas where we cope with change is at the level of the team and the individuals. And the individuals are on teams in organizations. And those are the sites where we can actually deal with what's coming our way and make sense of it and figure out ways and so on. So I mean, for me, the main thing that I heard in the conversation is enough of all of these models. Let's get to people who they really are, how they're growing, how they are developing their own capacity to connect and to deal with uncertainty, alone and together. And that's like a whole lot of things that come out of that, of course. I mean, now you can actually go to people who are supposedly empowered and challenge them. Or not challenge them, work around them. You know, we all do this in bureaucracies. We work around. We like not follow those rules because they don't suit us. This works better. Yeah, the rule says that, but do that, that's working. You know, that's the reality of organizations. They've got this pretense of this massive hierarchy, but it's actually quite anarchic in the best organizations. So encourage anarchy by giving everyone, developing everyone's agency. Maybe I went too far again.
Now you're going. You're bringing up stuff that we don't have time to talk about now. Cool. Okay, so in our last 2 minutes, I hear you about the models, and I think that's something that we are getting right in our change champion workshops, in our change leadership workshops, in our leadership development programs. where we say, there's a curve. It looks like the grief curve, and people will go through it. There's going to be some shock. There's going to be some denial. There's going to be a low point at the bottom of that U, and then you get out. And by just thinking about that, it's the leader's responsibility and role is to help people navigate through that. And how do you do that? And then go to it's your responsibility to have the conversations, to get the voices heard, to allow people to express how they feel. But you are the walk the talk person. So you're going to have to go first to say, I'm scared. It was a shock. I'm not sure what's coming. I don't have all the information. To start bringing those conversations out. And yeah, the personal development, I mean, you can't step into a leadership role if you don't understand yourself, if you don't know yourself, and if you don't constantly work on yourself and allow that in your teams. And I love how you brought it back to teams, Christy, because that's also such a big focus at the moment. Cool. So I hope everybody had fun. I hope we left you with not more questions than answers, but maybe new questions, maybe new ways of thinking about it, maybe new ideas. And just as a close, I want to invite you. We've got some stuff coming up, workshops that we've scheduled. We've decided to take the leap and put dates in the diaries again, because we believe it's a time to take action. And we've got a workshop coming up called Change Champions on the 9th of September. It's a 4-hour workshop, and that's what it does. It introduces the basic concepts of change. How do I work with resistance? Resistance is the communication. The resistance is where you get the feedback. Resistance is where you allow people to speak. We also have a OD and change course, which introduces some change management principles, but from the concept of organization development and how to work with that in complexity. That starts on the 22nd of September. And then our Leader Shift workshop, which is a workshop that enables team members to step into the role of team leader and all the complexities that comes with it. And one of the modules in there is change leadership. And I think there's quite a few of the things that we discussed today that sits in there. And then, of course, the very exciting employee engagement and experience certification that starts in August. So if anybody wants more information, you've all got my email address. Let us know. And thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for having a voice and for contributing. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.